Actually, we have a 2-minute countdown now. No, for services, yeah. But yeah, no. I knew what time it was, but I looked up there and it's still 9:31. So my clock says 9:33, so I'll split the difference and go right in the middle. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're going to be in Exodus chapter 1, so go ahead and open up to that. I think I scared Melina last week when she asked how we were covering Exodus, and I said we're going to do it verse by verse. We're just going to go all the way through Exodus, one verse at a time. That is, of course, not the way we're going to do it. If you've ever been in any class I've ever taught ever, then you know that's not ever how I'm going to do things. I just don't enjoy that, especially when it comes to a book like Exodus, because it is such a sequential book, but I think there's a lot of things to it that you can get lost in the weeds and forget kind of what the whole story is all about. And so the way we're going to take it, obviously, as you can see up there on the board, is how to make a nation. It's very much about nation building, nation identity, that kind of thing. And obviously, it's a very historical book, but as I've mentioned, I think last week, it's also, in my opinion, a very philosophical book as well. But we'll obviously take it. We're not going to kind of get too much into the woo-woo and the theoretical and that kind of thing. But I do think there are things that are put in this history book to make it very much a relevant book even for us in today's world. Before we start, though, I'll ask Chris if he doesn't mind to lead us in a word of prayer.
Dear Lord, Heavenly Father, we give thanks that we're able to wake up on this beautiful day today. We're able to enjoy this congregation, to spend time with our family and our friends, and our Christian family here as well. We give thanks for the teachers for this new quarter, that they take the responsibility to teach the young ones. We give thanks for Brady to allowing us to teach us, and using his form of teaching to give us in a format that we can easily understand it and to give it to those around us. Lord, we pray for those right now that are suffering in this world, specifically those in South Texas, Mexico, that are struggling through the floods, and that we pray that you are with those first responders, with the families, and all those who are suffering right now through the pain and the losses that they've received. We pray that we can do our part to help them as well. In all things we pray in Jesus' name.
Man, thank you. As you can see, we're going to be starting Exodus, and this is kind of an introduction. Obviously, we're not going to be jumping too deep into chapter 1. We're not going to take all 40 chapters, obviously, in order. We're going to kind of take it in sections. Today is an introduction. Next week will be largely about Moses and his kind of role in Egypt and the Israelites' roles in Egypt before obviously Moses comes back. So we'll kind of take that as a chunk by itself. But today is largely an introduction. I mentioned earlier that it is seen very much as a historical book. And I think if I were to ask you what Exodus is about, people would probably mention historical things. But when it comes to Exodus, I think it's very much a philosophical book. I think there are things that God wants to get across to his people that have to do with nation building. So that's going to be kind of the big theme that we will cut across as we go through it this quarter. I will ask the obvious question because it's such a great lead-in question for the entire quarter. What is Exodus about? What is this book about? If you were to kind of sum it up in a few words, a few sentences, a few hours. Go ahead, Curtis.
About the exodus of the descendants of Abraham, and God had promised to Abraham that he would bless, that he would take them from the captivity of the Egyptians.
Mm-hmm. So you can't use the name of the book in the definition. It is the exodus of the people out of Egypt. But you're right. I mean, if you think about what Exodus is about, Exodus obviously is a very simple word. It means some kind of taking out or moving out from place to place. And so when we think about the book of Exodus, we think about it in terms of they leave Egypt, they go all the way to Canaan. That's basically the moral of the story. That is probably the gist of it. How else would you describe the book of Exodus? Yeah, Kim? That's true, too, and that's kind of how I want to end the second half of this class. That's kind of what I want to talk about, because I think there are things there that we sometimes overlook for why they're even there to begin with and how this whole situation came about. But you're right. I mean, Exodus does kind of take, at least in the first several verses of the first chapter, how they even ended up, how this situation developed. So I do think you're right about that, for sure. How else would you describe this book of Exodus? You stole that from my introduction, but yes. And of course you're going to get the gold star because that's exactly where I'm headed with it. But yeah, and that's why I wanted to get this across, is when we sometimes think about the book of Exodus, we sometimes think it's just a book that talks about them leaving Egypt, and that is true. That is, in fact, what the word is about. The book of the departure from Egypt, you can look at it in a couple different ways. If you're looking at just the title, people will call it the book of names. That's another way that you can look at it. But the Exodus really doesn't go that far into it. If you think about how Exodus is structured, the departure from Egypt ends roughly Exodus chapter 17, 18. That's when they're out of Egypt, they're crossing the Red Sea. You still have 22 more chapters to go. And so if you kind of typify Exodus as just being them leaving Egypt, then you've got quite a bit of scriptural real estate that says, well, there's more things that happen there. And so I think you kind of have to take it all in its entirety. Go ahead.
A lot of it is God leading and providing.
Right.
I mean, all through there, you see him providing different things they need.
Right. And that, go ahead.
That's all.
And that goes back, I think, to what John was talking about. When you think about them coming out and they're forming their identity, it's not just about their identity as a people, but especially their relationship with God. And I think that kind of colors this whole book as well, because obviously it impacts who they are, who God is, their relationship with each other. And that's why I think you have almost a third of the entire book dedicated to just the priesthood and the tabernacle. Because if you're going to have this relationship with God, you have to have that established first. You have to know who you are in relationship to Jehovah. Do these people at the beginning of Exodus have any understanding of who God is by the time Exodus opens up? John is shaking his head no.
They're really polytheists. They have their Egyptian gods that they worship all.
Well, I don't know if they have Paul. They brought some of them, and that's true, but you can make the same argument about patriarchs. If you look at Jacob and Laban, if you look at Isaac, you can talk about them taking their household gods. That's mentioned specifically in regards to Rachel. So the way in which they would see gods probably is a little different than we would see them, but I think you're exactly right. Yeah.
I think they understood they had the promise.
Yeah.
In this book, he shows them that he's going to give them that through his power.
Right.
Through what he does to have them be set free.
Right, and that's why I think when you look at Exodus, the Israelites at the beginning of Exodus, do they have an understanding about God? Yes, I think you know that because Moses obviously believed that he was the bringer of some kind of deliverance. Why would he believe that if there wasn't some kind of tradition passed down? And I do think when you look at Genesis and talks about chapter 14, where it talks about Abraham, eventually these people are going to be delivered. I think there was some anticipation of that. But how that comes about and what form, what that looks like, I think all of that is vastly misunderstood by those people. And so that's why I think, yes, they do have an understanding of God, but Exodus deepens that understanding. And that's really what this whole book is about. Somebody have any thoughts or comments before we get started? When you get into Exodus, there's all sorts of, I think things you can put through when you talk about why these people are there, and there's all sorts of questions that you can ask about the book in general. The first one, obviously, you can ask the question, why are they in slavery to begin with? That's certainly something we'll talk about this morning. You can also ask them the question, who freed them from Egypt? That's another easy question that you can just kind of talk about as you're discussing the book of Exodus. But here's the other question I think that you can discuss to kind of set the stage for what we're going to be looking at this quarter. Why were these people freed from slavery? Why were they free from Egypt? There's an easy answer, there's a medium answer, and then there's a really convoluted answer that I don't even understand. Go ahead, Cameron.
They cried out to God for their oppressive slavery. They wanted to be freed. So
Right.
somewhat aspect at least.
Yeah, I would put that in the medium answer category. I do think that their deliverance is a response of their direct call towards God. God says to Moses, I think a couple times in those first few chapters, I've heard their plea, I've heard their cry, I'm going to go out and deliver them. I think that's spot on. I saw another hand over here. At least I thought I did. It wasn't yours, but go ahead, Chris.
Could it be related to kind of God's retribution towards Pharaoh himself and kind of the expansion? Because after the Exodus movement, the Egyptian culture kind of goes down.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because that's not something I was going to touch on in this class, but you brought up two kind of things there. Number one, the idea of revenge, the idea that these people are kind of putting Israelites, God's people, in slavery. And so the Egyptian Exodus is kind of seen as God's judgment on them. I think you can certainly make a case for that in regards to the plagues. There's a slippery slope in regards to that in terms of what these people are responsible for and just how vindictive some people view God as being through that process. So I certainly think you can make a case for revenge. But I think also what you mentioned there is the way in which Egypt kind of conceptualizes the Israelite Exodus, because if you look in secular history, there is no mention of any kind of Exodus at all, which you would think if there's some kind of situation where 2.5 million people are leaving, you'd think there'd be a footnote in some kind of history record There's not at all, I think largely because they want to just forget this entire period. And there's a whole lot of other theories you can bring about with that. Nathan?
Also fulfilled, it's the beginning of promise fulfillment from Abraham,
Right.
Isaac, Jacob, to make the people and that land promise.
Right. Yeah, I think if you look at it just in general, it's the fulfillment of a promise that goes back to Genesis. God said he would do something. This is him doing it. And so there's a very simple explanation for that. John, did you have? Okay. Curtis?
I was just thinking about how you also consider that it was their whole defensive system was annihilated. Their king, Pharaoh, was wiped off the face of the earth. Everything that they had, all their security was lost, and their means of production for the large part, the Hebrews that left. So yeah, that's an aspect of their history they don't forget.
Yeah, they're not a big fan of that. And this isn't something that is funny, obviously, especially in regards to recent events. But when you think about how Pharaoh goes with his army off into the wilderness, those people in Egypt are still expecting him to come back. I mean, they probably didn't know that he was going to be gone. But certainly when it gets, that story eventually did filter, because by the time you get up to Joshua and Jericho, Rahab hears what happens, and obviously that has a huge effect on the psyche. But you're right, Egyptian history is not going to be keen on recording this type of event. But you'd still think there'd be something, and there's literally nothing. Why else do you think that they were freed? We got identity, God's promises called back. That's probably true too. I mean, you got 9+ months of plagues. You're thinking, we just want this to be over with. Just, you're way more trouble than you're worth. Shell? Right. Yeah, and I think that's why I was kept asking these questions, because I think the tendency is to look backwards. We look at Egypt, we look at the promises, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there was a sense in which the Exodus was a fulfillment aspect. It was creating something as much as it was removing something. And so I think you have to look at both aspects of it if you're going to kind of tell this story. Curtis?
They cried out to God when injustice was going on.
Right, they cried out to him, and God heard them. Yeah, he remembers his people. That's what he tells Moses. Look in Exodus chapter 6. We're going to be jumping around a little bit this morning because this is just an introduction. Exodus chapter 6, starting in verse 2. Exodus chapter 6, starting in verse 2. It says, God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am the Lord, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as God Almighty, but by my name Lord I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. Furthermore, I've heard the groaning of the sons of Israel because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage. I've remembered my covenant. Those are all the reasons that we just kind of gave out there. Verse 6, say therefore to the sons of all Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you to the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I will give it to you for a possession. I am the Lord. What does God say about this process? Because this, I think, is before all the plagues start. This is when he's just talking to the heads of Israel, kind of outlaying what the plan is. Paul?
He made a promise, and it was time to fulfill the promise, and the only way that could be done was to choose these people to be free. They obviously couldn't fulfill that promise in Egypt, so he was choosing this moment in time to move them to some other location where that promise would be fulfilled.
That's true. If you look at just the Exodus in general, the promise once again was made to Abraham. I'm going to redeem these people. Moses gives a specific timeline, 430 years. These people are going to be moved. So you do have that happening. You can't redeem them while they're still in Egypt. You have to take them physically to another location. But what else does he say in these verses about the purpose behind the Exodus?
He says, I will take you for my people.
Right.
I will be your God, and you shall know me.
Exactly. That's, to me, that's the key phrase in this entire section, at least for our purposes this morning. Why does God free these people? What is he hoping to create? This is where you see fulfillment in the New Testament, all that kind of thing. What was he hoping to create? Curtis, go ahead.
People for God's own possession.
Right, a people for God's own possession. And that seems to be the recurring theme when you look throughout the Old Testament. God's relationship with Israel is all around this idea of, you're my people, I'm your God. If you disobey me, that reflects poorly on me. It's a smear on our reputation. So you see this kind of synergistic relationship between the people and God right here at the outset. How you act is how it represents on me. My response towards you, especially in regards to the golden calf incident, which is what Moses reminds him of, that's going to reflect on me. So essentially he creates a people for himself. You can see the fulfillment of that in the New Testament with the church. But this has always kind of been his idea, is to create a people that's special to him. And that's repeated in Deuteronomy. The whole reason he brought you out wasn't because you were the best, but because he loved you. John and then John.
Comment on in the New Testament, we're a God's chosen people now.
Right.
We're a peculiar people, we're a nation.
Right.
Priests, to God.
Right.
And so that's what the Israelites were.
Yeah, and then to kind of preempt the sermon for today, I think the way in which we interact with other people speaks a lot about the God that we serve, or at the very least, the God we think we serve. So yeah, I think both of those. Thank you, John. Go ahead, John.
What was the initial reason for the oppression that people were experiencing in Egypt? What was the initial reason for that?
I know, but I don't want to give away because we're going to talk about it in 10 minutes, but go ahead.
Well, they were multiplying in people of Egypt. You remember back in the days of Joseph and everything. They
Right.
were there. And when the new Pharaoh came into power, then it ended up they were afraid that they were going to multiply so much that they were just going to
Yeah,
take over.
it's a power play. I mean, the persecution of the Israelites is 100% a power play. They're worried about getting out of power. They're worried that the Israelites are going to take them over, which is probably a bigger reality than we think about, especially when you look back. You think, well, Egypt's always been there. I mean, it very well could have not have been had they not taken power. You can fast forward that to the New Testament too. Why did the Pharisees get rid of Jesus? Because Jesus posed a threat to their power. So you can make a whole bunch of corollaries with the Old Testament and the New Testament, but you're right. It all ultimately goes back to ego, and that's a relationship that I think is interesting when you dive into Exodus. So I agree with that 100%. Did I see another hand up there? It's the day of phantom hands again. Look in verse 9. Moses spoke to the sons of Israel, but they did not listen to Moses on account of their despondency and their cruel bondage. What is Israelites' response back to this plan? I'm going to take you out of Egypt, Moses says, or God says through Moses. I'm going to redeem you. You're going to be his people. What do the people say back to him? They didn't believe him. Why not? They were despondent, and this comes after the brick making has intensified, so obviously they're going to be very upset. Why did they not believe Moses? Paul?
It's also quite a large claim to make. I think just the magnitude of what the promise was hard to understand.
Right.
Besides the fact that they were under oppression would probably skew their thought.
It's hard to imagine anybody, and of course you can talk about this for years and years, but it's hard to imagine anybody that's under that strenuous of a yoke of slavery thinking about freedom at all. Because for at least 4 generations, you have people that all they've known is this bondage, and all they known is that it's intensified. So the idea that this Moses, who they knew of previously, who came back, and he's kind of going to talk about how this God's going to appear and he's going to free them, that's a lot for them to take. And I don't think that they're going to be so hip to that idea. Joe, go ahead.
Well, and how first were they with God?
Yeah. They didn't know him.
Yeah, they didn't know him. They didn't have the faith.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, here Moses been gone 40 years
Mm-hmm.
because he killed somebody.
Yeah.
And he comes back and said, well, my service to you is over. We're going to go. I got a God that says we're going to be free.
Yeah, and if anybody does remember what Moses did, they probably remembered his first attempt at freedom. That didn't go that great. So what makes you think this is going to go any better? And Moses preempts this, by the way. When Moses is talking to the burning bush, he says, I know that you want me to go and tell these people that they're going to be free, but who should I say sent me? Because they're going to ask what the authority is for all this. So Moses understands the situation at play, for sure. Gary?
An extension of that is, even if it's hard to imagine and think about freedom, if there's a risk to that, if this doesn't work out, there's this thought that it could be worse than it was. So although I want it, I'm just going to be safe here.
Right. And that goes with the nature of any rebellion. There's going to be people that are fired up about it, and then there's going to be a larger middle percentage that says, well, I kind of like what I have, and I don't want to lose that. And you see that mentality even drifting into the wilderness when they're still thinking about their cucumbers back in the day. I remember back in Egypt we had all these things. So this rebellion isn't even classified as a success, I would argue, until they even made it to Canaan, which is 40 years down the road. So there's no real sense in which any of these people believed that any of this was actually going to benefit them. If you look in Exodus chapter 19, this is after the plagues, this is after they've been liberated. Exodus chapter 19, starting verse 7, the first 6 verses, God tells them the exact same thing he says in Exodus chapter 6. This is an interesting kind of parallel passage. He says literally the exact same thing. I'm bringing you out of Egypt. This is the reason I'm bringing you out of Egypt. The response, though, is different this time. Verse 7, Moses came and called the elders of the people and set before them all these words which the Lord had commanded him. Verses 1 through 6 is almost exactly what he says in Exodus chapter 6. This time in verse 8, the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken we will do. Why are they keen on following God now? They've seen what he can do, exactly. So this is part of that relationship building, that understanding of God. And this is, I mean, you can make, and this is going to be a real struggle for me this quarter to just fill this whole thing with New Testament allusions. But you see this with new converts. People will say, well, I believe in God and I follow him and I trust him. But their understanding of God is very limited to just the salvation aspect or maybe just faith and grace or whatever it may be. But as you understand more and more about God, your reliance on him and your faith deepens over time. Go ahead.
Also a bit of a parallel with the New Testament there.
Mm-hmm.
400 years of not hearing from God in the New Testament day.
Right.
What they've just gone through with how many years, without hearing anything from God.
You're exactly right. I'm going to put an asterisk because I'm going to say that we know of. They didn't hear from God that we know of. And so I would argue you're right. They don't know who this God is. They don't know Jehovah. This fugitive comes back after 40 years saying he saw a God in the wilderness. I'm not going to risk my family over something like that. I need some proof first. And so you can understand kind of where they're coming from. If you look at kind of the timeline of Exodus as a whole, and this is what we mentioned at the beginning, there are 3 definite stages of this book, and each one of them kind of has their own significant section. You have the situation in Egypt. All 3 of them are location bound. So you have Egypt, Exodus chapters 1 through 15, roughly the middle point of that chapter. All of the things that happen in that first part happen in Egypt, with the exception of Moses and Midian. Obviously, there's some verses here and there. But largely that all happens in Egypt. Then you have this wilderness section. This is where you have the golden calf incident that happens in chapters 15 through 18. This is after they cross the Red Sea. So you have this wandering, you have these battles, you have the golden calf. You have all these things that kind of take place. Then you have, at the base of Mount Sinai, this is the golden calf incident. Half the book happens at the base of Mount Sinai. The golden calf incident, the tabernacle instructions, the priestly instructions, all of those things happen at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses is up there for a period of time, comes back. He goes back up for a period of time, comes back down. There's a whole lot of things that happen. Once you're free, now you need to understand who it was that set you free. And I think that's the division between those 2 different sections. You can also compartmentalize these sections in this way. With Egypt, you have God is firmly established as the deliverer. He's the one that brings these people out of Egypt. As he says himself, I bring them out with a mighty hand. That's the whole notion of God being a deliverer. Then you have in the wilderness, you have God being a provider. How does he provide for these people? He feeds them. I thought you said he eats them. That'd be a different story. Yeah, he feeds them with manna. He brings water out of the rock. So you have that supernatural type of provisions that take place there in those middle sections. And then you have this last section, which is essentially God is supreme. The one thing that Israel needed to learn about God more than anything else was that he's the boss. He's in control. They're his people. These are his laws. This is his relationship. They don't do anything outside the purview of his authority and responsibility. That's going to be a huge issue for them. Probably not as huge of an issue as we think because they're used to this idea of somebody being boss over them. So it's probably not as huge of a struggle for them as it would be for a society like ours. But they still need to recognize who this was. Curtis, you had your hand up the whole time. Go ahead. Yeah, the brazen serpent. Yeah, that's a whole different story. But they still obviously acted outside of God's authority. But yeah, there's that situation too. Look in Exodus chapter 15. So go back a few chapters if you're still in 19. Look in Exodus chapter 15. This is the Song of Moses. This is after they crossed the Red Sea. Exodus chapter 15, starting in verse 9. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall be gratified against them. I will draw up my sword, and my hand will destroy them. You blew with your wind, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you among the gods, O Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in praises, working wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your loving kindness you have led the people whom you have redeemed. In your strength you have guided them to your holy habitation. The peoples have heard, they trembled. Anguish has gripped the inhabitants of Philistia. What does this section in Exodus 15 talk about? Remember, after the Red Sea, they part it. Moses writes this song and then teaches it to the people. This is something you need to remember. What does this section teach in verses 9 through 14?
It's basically what just happened with the defeat of Egypt at the Red Sea, but
Mm-hmm.
it goes a little further than that and is planting the seeds for what's to come and how the people of Philistia have already been gripped with fear, which they did not take into account.
Right. Yeah, the peoples of Philistia are always going to be kind of that thorn in their flesh. If you remember, there's a section in Exodus when God leads them out of Egypt. He leads them around the area of the Philistines because he knows that people are going to see war and they're going to tremble, they're going to run off. But you're right, you are preempting kind of this future clash between Israel and the Philistines. The Philistines recognize what God is all about, so you do have that that's built into that. What else does this teach, though, in verses 9 through 14?
They're acknowledging his ability, basically his awesomeness, as well as his kindness.
Yeah, his abilities, I think, is in center stage here. His kindness, his grace, his mercy, those kind of dual sides. You can argue they're dual sides. They could obviously be the same type of thing. That's all in there as well. John?
Well, it's also, it's laid out here, I think the foundations that are given more expression in the major prophet. And it says, who is like thee among the gods, O Lord? Who is like thee, majestic, O holy?
Right.
You know, God, I put in Isaiah, I think, talked about who is there, what God is there above me.
Right.
Who can match me, basically is what it says.
Yeah. And I like that verse specifically because if you look at Exodus, at least in one interpretation of the God Jehovah against gods of Egypt, that kind of battle that's played out through chapters 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, that is solved by the time you get to chapter 15. There's no question anymore who the God is, who's ruler over all. And that development I think is interesting because when you look at the first couple miracles that Moses does, the sorcerers are able to replicate it. And so that illusion of control from the sorcerers is slowly decaying. Now there's no question who reigns supreme. And so I think that's a big part of that too. What else do you see in those verses? The uniqueness of God is highlighted. That's a little bit of what John was talking about. Let me ask another question. How intense, how vivid, how impactful, that's the key word I'm looking for. How impactful is the crossing of the Red Sea for these people? It's a fun children's story, obviously. How impactful is it for these people? Go ahead.
Well, we just read the section where they agreed to whatever God said was going to do. It didn't affect them so much they saw the power of God to deliver them.
Right.
It made them believers.
They saw the power of God. You said a couple of things there that I think are interesting. Number one, you said they saw the power of God up front and it also made them believers. I think what's fascinating about that is when you look at how the plagues overlap inside of Egypt, there's some argument about, they saw this, they saw this, they saw this, and all these kind of happened all over the place in Egypt. This is a without a doubt moment where you witness the power of God that is fully unleashed against the second part that I was thinking of, the greatest army on earth at that point. And so if you're an Israelite and you're looking at this, you can look at the plagues, and some of these obviously look natural, the boils, the flies, and those kinds. Some of them look natural. There's no escaping the fact that a gigantic flood of water just annihilated an entire army. The only way that happened is by the hand of God. And so looking future-wise, if you're thinking about this from their perspective, there's nothing on earth that can touch us. That's what it should have meant to them. There's nothing on earth that can touch us if we have faith in this. And that's once again why you can't put God in a box. If you're thinking about why God doesn't like idolatry and why he says you shall make no graven image of me, you can't compartmentalize him as the God of the seas or as the God of the land or the skies because he's everything. And that's why when Moses asked the question, who shall I say sent me? God says, I am who I am. Why does he say that? I am who I am. Part of it is what we just talked about. There's no exact definition to describe what God is. You can't really just say it. Paul?
That's always been confusing to me, but I think he's saying there is no other entity even close.
Right.
And unique.
Right. If he says, like if you have a, and I don't know if this analogy is going to work exactly, but if you say my name is Brady, which my name is Brady, at least as far as I know, my dad may have a different story about that, but if my name is Brady, that differentiates me from John, from Sammy, from Corley. It differentiates me from other humans. If you give a name to a God, that differentiates him from other gods. But when God says, I am who I am, it basically signifies he is alone and there is none like him. He doesn't need a name because he's singular in nature. So it speaks to his overwhelming supremacy.
Your observation about your name is correct, but that's only one aspect, because all the rest of you is like all the rest of us. Basically, the anatomy's the same, the powers, all that.
Right.
But that's not the case with God. There isn't anything even close, and we can't even describe it. Because exactly what he is.
Right. You can't put any kind of physical description about God because we don't have one, but also because you can't, all we know is how we interact with him. And we can describe those things, but that doesn't give the whole picture of him. Yeah. Go ahead, Gary.
Yeah, during this time period, I mean, a large part of their identities were, I am the son of, who is the son of.
Right.
And this who I am kind of connotates and brings and implies that there was no causation for him. He
Right.
just was.
Yeah, I just am. And that's the same thing you see in Revelation. I'm the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, the bride and morning star. There's no description of me that can be encapsulated by time. I just am. And that's the best description God can give of himself. Somebody else have any thoughts on that? We're going to revisit this point obviously later, but I think it's worth kind of pointing out at this point. Okay, let me ask you this. How did Israel end up in Egypt? This is what Ken was talking about a second ago, or 30 minutes ago. I forgot, lost track of time. How did Israel end up in Egypt to begin with? A drought. I was wondering kind of see where people's starting point would be. I see drought and famine. Go ahead, Curtis.
Joseph went down and set up a plan to save Egypt. He also saved the nations around because they could buy the wheat that they needed to. And his brethren ended up moving down there.
Right. That's what's interesting about it is Paul and Nathan said the exact, roughly the same type of thing, which was drought, famine. Both of those things kind of happened together. That puts it more towards when the brothers came down there. You mentioned Joseph's down there, and he's kind of starting the situation there. Ken, go ahead.
I think it started with sibling rivalry and jealousy.
As all great stories do, yeah. Younger brother wins, by the way. That's the moral of this story. Go ahead.
But it was, you and I talked about problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Too many coincidences for it not to be God.
Yeah, and that's why I start the story way back at the beginning when Joseph is first sold into slavery, precisely because of what you just said. When Joseph is talking to his brothers, he says the phrase that is kind of alluded to elsewhere. You see it in Esther, for instance. But where Joseph says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. God sent me ahead of you to preserve life. So the exodus that comes out of Egypt was initially meant for something that was positive. It was designed to save God's people. And there's all sorts of, kind of parallels you can make with Egypt, what it means as a metaphor. Jesus goes into Egypt, or his parents do, to kind of save his life. But regardless, in my opinion, Joseph is sold into slavery. You have that beginning there in Genesis chapter 37. Eventually, you have, as what was mentioned over here by these guys, you have the famine that forces the brothers to Egypt. That happens in Genesis chapter 42 and verse 1. In my opinion, the most fantastic verse in the entire book of Genesis is when Jacob looks at his 12 sons and he says, why are you all staring at each other? Go down to Egypt and get food so that we don't die of starvation. That verse is in Genesis chapter 42 and verse 1 that kind of kickstarts it moving forward. Immediately after you have the brothers being sent to Egypt, you have this long system where Joseph is interacting with his brothers. He's kind of playing them. Why is Joseph mean to his brothers? We don't have time to go through this in Exodus, so obviously we've got to talk about it now. Why is Joseph mean to his brothers? That's exactly right. Sometimes you need to teach them a lesson. That's a revenge that's 20 years in the making. Why is it that Joseph plays with his brothers or treats them poorly? Or does he treat them poorly? There's obviously room for debate amongst that. You got to say it with that gravelly voice that Joe just said it too. Why does Joseph treat his brothers poorly? If you're Joseph, before you announce yourself to your brothers, why would you put them through the ringer like that? Curtis?
That he wants to find out what his brothers are still, what they're all about.
I think that's the most accurate answer, in my opinion, is that he wants to see if they've really changed at all. Because if you think about where Joseph's at this point, the last memory he has of his brothers is what? What's the last thing he remembers his brothers doing to him? Yeah, selling them in the pit. Garrett is just having an awful morning right now. Yeah, his last memory is them selling him into his pit. And half of them are debating about whether or not they should what? Kill him, exactly. And somebody has a much better idea. Why don't we sell him? That way we can make a little money on the side. So Joseph, I think, is looking at his brothers thinking, I don't know if I can even disclose myself to you because I don't know if you've truly changed. And I think Joseph alludes to that a little bit throughout that discussion. I can't just imagine that he's just ruthless and mean because I don't think that settles, I don't think that fits with his personality. But eventually Joseph sends for Jacob. Jacob comes back to Egypt. You can see this in Genesis chapter 47 and verse 1. It says in verse 1, if you would flip there, Joseph went in and told Pharaoh and said, my father, my brothers, and their flocks and their herds, and all that they have come out of the land of Canaan. And behold, they're in the land of Goshen. He took 5 men from among his brothers, presented them to Pharaoh. Pharaoh said to his brothers, this is Genesis 47, verse 3, what is your occupation? They said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They said to Pharaoh, we have come to sojourn in the land, for there is no pasture for your servants' flocks, for the famine, or drought, is severe in the land of Canaan. Now therefore, please let your servants live in the land of Goshen. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, your father and your brothers have come to you. The land of Egypt is at your disposal. Settle your father and your brothers in the best of the land. Let them live in the land of Goshen. And if you know of any capable men among them, put them in charge of my livestock. Joseph's brothers eventually settle in the land of Goshen. That's where they're at for the duration of their captivity. Eventually they'll filter throughout the greater part of Egypt. But at least at this point, what is their occupation? And they mention it to Pharaoh. This is where we need to live because of what? What is the occupation of the nation of Israel? They are shepherds. Thank you, Debbie/Nathan. That's exactly right. They're shepherds, and so they want to live in Goshen. Obviously, Pharaoh has no problem giving that land to them. Curtis?
The fact that they're shepherds, that they keep goats and other animals, is an abomination to the Egyptians because of their God.
Yeah, that's another part of that too, is the relationship between the Israelites and Egyptians is not going to be good for a long period of time. They're there, but they don't want them there. That's polar opposite of Pharaoh's disposition. And I think this part of the story can't be highlighted enough. Why does Pharaoh have a favorable disposition towards Joseph? And by extension, the nation of Israel? Because he saved them, exactly. You can see Joseph is in charge of the land, of the administration. That whole 7 years of famine, 7 years of healthy, that's one part of it. Why else does Pharaoh have a favorable disposition towards Joseph? He interpreted his dream. I think he did, yeah. I say those things hoping for a grunt of agreement, and I got one, so I was happy about that. He served faithfully for years, and that's another aspect of Joseph is everywhere Joseph goes, he prospers. He's in Potiphar's house, he prospers. He's in the prison, he prospers so much so that the jailer takes kindly to him. He's at Pharaoh's house, he prospers. So there's no argument that the Israelites are great at whatever they do. Everything that's under your hands, they eventually prosper. The same thing can be said for Jacob. That's why Laban wants to keep Jacob around. So they're very, very good at what they do. The disposition towards towards Pharaoh and Joseph is great. That's not going to be the whole story, though. What eventually happens after this? The Israelites settle in Goshen, and Exodus 1 hits and everything goes haywire. Is that right? What happens in between this? And this isn't the only reason why I think Pharaoh has a favorable disposition towards Joseph. So that's in Exodus chapter 1. We're going to get to that in just a second. But Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8, a Pharaoh rises that doesn't know Joseph. That phrase, doesn't know Joseph, is very much rooted in animosity. It's not that he doesn't know the name, it's that he doesn't care about the name. That's the point of Exodus 1 and verse 8. What happens after the Israelites settle in Goshen? Because it's not just that Joseph is really great at his job. Why does Pharaoh love Joseph? Everything he does prospers. Pharaoh loves Joseph because Joseph gave Pharaoh Egypt. And I think you can make a strong case for that in Genesis 47. Look at this. We never talk about this section, but this shows Joseph's administration capabilities in real time. We tend to think, oh, he's just great at the food distribution, and he was, there's no question. But I think you can make an argument that Joseph fundamentally changes the economical landscape of Egypt, so much so that he gives Pharaoh the nation of Egypt. Verse 13 of Genesis chapter 47. Now there was no food in all the land because the famine was very severe, so that the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan languished because of the famine. So that's the situation that takes place. Joseph gathered all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan for the grain which they bought, and Joseph brought the money and put it into Pharaoh's house. So he's basically collecting all the riches and all the wealth. When the money was all spent in the land of Egypt and the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came to Joseph and said, "Give us food, for why should we die in your presence, for our money is gone?" Notice what's taking place here. Egyptians are asking Joseph for assistance. Joseph said, "Give up your livestock, and I will give you food for your livestock, since your money is all gone." So they brought their livestock to Joseph, and Joseph gave them food in exchange for the horses and the flocks and the herds and the donkeys, and he fed them with food in exchange for all their livestock that year. Year one, Joseph takes all of their animals in exchange for food. Verse 18, when that year was ended, they came to him the next year and said to him, "We will not hide from my lord all that our money is all spent, and the cattle are my lord's. There's nothing for my lord except our bodies and our lands. Why should we die before your eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for food, and we and our land will be slaves to Pharaoh. So give us seed that we may live and not die, and that the land may not be desolate." What happens now? Curtis? Well, they come back to him. They come back to him now and say, "We're still hungry. We've spent all the food. We've eaten all the food that you've given to us. The only thing we have left is not our livestock. What do we have now?" What's that? Well, we have our land. Do you see that? I think in verse 20. Yeah, we will give our land, and we will also be slaves for you. So you have the land and slavery. That's an interesting, I think, note, because in Exodus chapter 1, who's the slaves? The Israelites. And yet you have Egyptians here in verses 19 and 20, or in 18, 19, and 20, saying, "We will be slaves for you." So you have this interesting kind of balance of power. Verse 20, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for every Egyptian sold his food, because this famine was severe upon them. Thus the land became Pharaoh's. As for the people, he removed them from the cities from one end, or removed them to the cities from one end of Egypt's border to the other. Only the land of the priests he did not buy, for the priests had an allotment from Pharaoh, which sounds a whole lot like the Levites. They lived off the allotment which Pharaoh gave them. Therefore they did not sell their land. Then Joseph said to the people, verse 23, "Behold, I have today bought you and your land for Pharaoh. Now here is seed for you, and you may sow the land. At the harvest," verse 24, "you shall give a fifth to Pharaoh, and 4/5 shall be for your own for seed of the field, and for your food, and for those of your households, and for those of your little ones." They said, verse 25, "You have saved our lives. Let us find favor in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Joseph's slaves." Joseph made it a statute concerning the land of Egypt, valid to this day, that Pharaoh should have the fifth. Only the land of the priests did not become Pharaoh's. How does Joseph change the balance of power in Egypt during his administration? He's great at what he does, but this is probably his biggest contribution in terms of the totality of Egypt. What does Joseph do? He makes everybody dependent on Pharaoh. And you can argue, how did Egypt become such a great nation? Well, you have to centralize power. This is a perfect example of somebody centralizing power. And so I think when you're talking about the impact that Joseph has in this land, it's not just that he was great. It's not just that he kept them alive. And all those things are absolutely correct. But it's that he essentially gives Egypt to Pharaoh. And so that makes Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8 even more remarkable. When it says that a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph, that's remarkable, considering that Joseph is mostly responsible for the Egypt that those people know when you get to Exodus chapter 1. Does anybody have any thoughts or comments on that? That's a section of Scripture that's sometimes ignored, but I think it's pretty huge. Getting back to what John was talking about at the beginning about how these people are increasing in power. In Genesis chapter 47, verse 27, Israel lived in the land of Egypt in Goshen. They acquired property in it. They were fruitful. They became very numerous. You have that foreshadowing what? Genesis 47 and verse 27. What is it foreshadowing? Israel is growing bigger and bigger and bigger, and what's going to happen? Go ahead.
Part of the fear of the Egyptians is Israel had grown so big.
Exactly. Right. John mentioned that at the beginning.
They were scared.
Right. They were absolutely scared of this growing base of people that were not only becoming more in number, but were also gaining power and land. Because at least at this point in Genesis 47, the power didn't rest with the people anymore, it rested with Pharaoh. So if you've got Pharaoh and Joseph is the administrator, you have these people growing in number, the everyday Egyptian is eventually in danger of being excluded from this whole situation. That leads directly into Exodus chapter 1 and verse 7. The sons of Israel were fruitful, increased greatly, multiplied, became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. What Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8 then immediately says right after that, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. It's not that he didn't know Joseph. What's the story there? When God says, "Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness, I never knew you." It's not that God doesn't know who those people are. What does he mean? They don't recognize them, disregards them. It's not unimportant, because I'm never going to say anybody's unimportant to God, but you're not of my people, my society, my culture, my whatever. And so that's the theme there in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 8. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph, didn't pay any attention to what Joseph had done, and so now he treats his descendants poorly. If you look at the end of Genesis, I think you can see this kind of coming to fruition, this kind of anticipation of future conflict. Genesis chapter 50, starting in verse 22. Joseph stayed in Egypt, he and his father's household, and Joseph lived 110 years. Joseph saw the third generation of Ephraim's sons, also the sons of Machir, the sons of Manasseh, were born on Joseph's knees. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised an oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob." In other words, I'm going to die, but you are not always going to be here. You need to understand that you're pilgrims. If you look in Exodus chapter 1 and verse 9, you have this kind of mention of the nation identity. Exodus chapter 1 and verse 9. He said to this people, talking about the king, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we." All that's leading into what will eventually be the Exodus. Why did they leave? Well, Pharaoh hated them. He mistrusted them. He was scared of them. And so he persecuted them. The plagues came to persecute them back, to kind of show the power. They were eventually forced out because of that. But you see all that tension building here at the end of Genesis.
Who was responsible for them multiplying like they were?
I feel like the answer is God, but I don't know if that's okay. Yeah.
I think that's obvious, because when they started to oppress them to try to keep them from multiplying,
Right.
they kept multiplying.
Yeah.
It didn't work.
Yeah.
I think that's because God was behind it.
Right. And that even happens in Exodus 1. It happens with Bethlehem in Matthew 1, where there's persecution of children, and that doesn't stop the children from being born. It just pushes them into hiding, which is where Moses came from. The reason that Moses is in the house of Pharaoh is because of the persecution that were placed on those mothers. It's just all a part of providence. Does anybody else have any thoughts or comments? All right, we'll pick up with Exodus 1 through, I think, 4 next week. Thank you, guys.